In the last section, we installed Materialize CSS as an NPM module into our project. We're now going to continue by hooking up the CSS files inside of this NPM package to our project. Now, again, the way in which we're doing this is not quite as straightforward as just using the link tag right here and pasting this into our HTML file. But this is something that you're seeing more commonly with CSS frameworks these days. So we're going to take the slightly more complicated approach, but understand what is actually going on behind the scenes when we install it as an NPM module. So let's get to it. The first thing I wanted to tell you about is the Webpack module that we are making use of that came as a part of the Create React App installation that we used. So when we installed Create React App and used it to generate a new project, we automatically got some infrastructure inside of our project that configures and makes use of Webpack. Webpack is what's called a module loader. We can feed in a big old web of files to it, and Webpack will automatically somehow concatenate together and arrange all of these different files in such a way that it spits out one or very few output files. So essentially, Webpack allows us to take a big old pile of separate JavaScript files and condense it down to one individual file. It doesn't always have to be one per se. Sometimes we want multiple files, but that's its own little discussion. Webpack is not only limited to processing JavaScript files like the ones we have right now, though. You can also load up what are called loaders into Webpack that instruct Webpack how to handle other types of files as well. In particular, one other file type that it will handle out of the box with our Create React App installation is CSS files. So if we import a CSS file directly into a JavaScript file, Webpack will look at the import statement, it will recognize that we are attempting to import in a CSS file, and it will include it into our project output as CSS rather than trying to parse it as actual raw JavaScript, which is exactly what we need. So that's the slightly more complicated way that I mentioned that we are hooking this thing up with NPM. Really, you want to have some idea of what Webpack is doing behind the scenes to really understand how we can somehow import it with import statements when using CSS files. So let's see what this actually looks like in practice. Inside my code editor, I'm going to find my client directory. So here it is right here. And then inside there, I'm going to find my node modules folder. And as a reminder, remember the node modules directory is where all of our project's dependencies are placed. If we scroll down very far inside this directory, we will eventually come across the material design or the materialized CSS library. So here it is right here. So let's open this up. Inside of there, you'll find a folder called dist. And then inside of there, you'll find a folder called CSS. And so right here are two CSS files. One is called materialize.css and the other is materialize.min. The min version right here is the minified version of all the CSS. So for us, we're going to include in the minified version because we're not really going to be referencing the raw CSS inside there. Like we don't really have to look at it or anything. So we're completely fine using the materialize min.css file. So in practice, all we really have to do is write an import statement that will require in or import in this file right here into our project structure. As soon as we do, whenever Webpack runs, and remember, it runs every time our application is changed, it'll automatically include in this CSS file. So let's see what that looks like. To import this file, the CSS file, I'm going to import it into our index.js file. In truth, it doesn't really matter where we put this import statement. All that matters is that we place an import for it at least one time inside of our application. I like to put it inside the index.js file just because it's a very root level requirement of our project. I think it just kind of makes sense there, but you can easily make the case to me to say that it should be inside the app.js file as well. Really, there's a couple different ways you can handle this one, and really they're all correct. Okay, so let's get to this. At the very top of the index.js file, I'm going to import in this CSS file. So I'll import materialize CSS from, and then we're going to provide the path to this file. We'll say materialize-css, so that's the name of the module, /dist, because that's the name of the directory, /css /materialize.min.css. So materialize .min.css, like so. Now, one thing I want to mention to you is that when we are importing non-JavaScript files, we do have to add on the file extension right here. So we can't get away with leaving the file extension off like we do with files that we import, like say the app import statement right here, or the reducers import. So these truly are .js files, but Webpack assumes that we mean .js if we leave that extension off. When we are importing anything else, yes, we have to use the .css extension to say, yeah, specifically this file right here. Okay, the other thing I want to mention is that you'll notice that we did not use any type of relative path name. So I didn't do something like // up here or anything like that. Whenever Webpack parses an import statement path like this, if you do not provide a relative path, Webpack automatically assumes that you are trying to specify a npm module, or a module that is installed inside of your node modules directory. So no need to specify a relative path here. We just say materialize CSS, and I want specifically this file inside of there. Okay, now the last thing I want to say is that when we import a CSS file like this, it doesn't actually assign anything to any variable inside the JavaScript world. So this variable that we just declared right here and presumably assigned some value to, we do not need at all. So we can condense down the import statement to just be the actual import this file. To do so, all we have to do is remove the variable name and the from statement. So overall, this entire thing becomes just import this CSS file, like that right there. Okay, so now when we save this, Webpack is going to run again. It's going to attempt to look at all the different files that we are importing into our application structure. One of them is now the CSS file, materialize.min.css. So Materialize is going to recognize this is a CSS file and treat it differently than it does the other JavaScript ones. And at the end of the day, it will produce a final output that includes all these JavaScript files that we have in addition to the the materialize.css file. Okay, so let's see what happens when we save it. I'll save the file. I'm going to condense down the node modules directory as well. And then when we go back over to the browser, now it's very hard to see. Well, let's refresh the page first. Oops, my mistake. We never restarted the server. So that's very important as well. Let's make sure we restart the server. So I'm inside the server directory and we'll run npm run dev. Now, rather than make you have to watch all my server startup, let's take a quick break. We'll come back in the next section and we will verify that the CSS file was successfully installed. So I'll see you in just a second.